Hello, and welcome back to Pantsuits and Lawsuits, your favorite place to learn about the latest about American law and ongoing litigation that might be of great interest to you.
Today, we will be talking to some career prosecutors, or at least one career prosecutor from our department, about a crime that, quite frankly, gets a lot of airtime, yet remains largely misunderstood, and that is human trafficking.
Yeah, human trafficking is pervasive. It's a global problem that generates between 150 to $250 billion a year on the black market, and it exploits vulnerable populations by doing so.
Yeah, that's a huge number, and it's to give it some context, you can sort of compare it to a couple of other big money-making enterprises. The NFL, for instance, it makes about $20 billion a year. And then Google, or its parent company, makes or is worth about $240 billion a year. So human trafficking brings in a lot of illicit money, and it's a huge, huge problem in this country.
Yeah, it really is. And until and unless we all really stand united in the battle against human trafficking, this crime is just going to continue to grow. And so it's just so important that we devote sufficient resources to allow law enforcement to root out these criminal actors.
Yep. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation today on our podcast, Dana, about this, and we can talk about human trafficking generally, and then I think we're going to talk a little bit about the Jeffrey Epstein scandal and what that means for
Yeah,
our
who doesn't want to
country.
talk about that?
I mean, it's in the news for sure. It's obviously brought human trafficking into the foreground in a way that nothing ever has, but and that's obviously a case of human trafficking involving billionaires. But as we know, as prosecutors, human trafficking doesn't always involve billionaires. In fact, most of the time it doesn't.
Yeah, and it
And
doesn't always involve, young white women.
Right. I mean, and it goes beyond sex trafficking too. So we have seen obviously human trafficking cases. We're both border states, and we've seen it down here in Arizona along the border, related to immigrants, labor trafficking. Obviously, sex trafficking is a huge issue, but labor trafficking is a growing issue here on the border, as folks are brought over, smuggled across the border, and then forced to work in jobs, and then essentially held in indentured servitude in some ways, by these smugglers, and then forced to pay the smugglers and pay off the debt, so that they accumulate for having been brought across the border. So it's really a pernicious, pernicious crime.
Yeah, and you see sort of whether it's sex trafficking or labor trafficking, you see the same things over and over again, where somebody might not speak the language, doesn't know anybody, their passport or any other identifying documents have been taken from them.
Right.
They are threatened, and whether there is force or violence used against them or the threat of violence to be used against them. These are people who oftentimes have nowhere to turn. And frankly, with what we're seeing now from the federal government, there's more and more reason to be concerned about anybody finding out who you are and especially reporting to law enforcement.
Yeah. I mean, I worry about that too. That is a huge concern, and we really need our immigrant community to feel like they can report to us. And with ICE roaming around the streets, indiscriminately arresting car washers and gardeners and hardworking people, I think it's going to be harder and harder to get folks who are being taken advantage of to report the situations that they're in, and these human smugglers. The real bad guys, the people who are engaged in this smuggling, whether it's sex trafficking or trafficking of people across the border for work related reasons, it's just going to get harder and harder. That's a really good point, Dana.
Yeah, but you look at what's happening right now in terms of this discussion of, the Epstein case and the president. And it's not just that it gets weirder and weirder. It's so ridiculous that as a result of the White House and Pam Bondi and the Department of Justice not releasing the files that they had promised to release for so long, who's the beneficiary of all this? Well, it's Maxwell, right? Who is the one person who's behind bars, and just things seem to be going her way. It gets better and better
Oh,
for her in
yeah,
terms of the more that they try to be evasive about it, the more she gets, transferred to, a minimum security prison. And now I hear that she's getting work release, and
yeah.
all in an effort, I assume, just to shut her up because she knows a lot. And this is her reward for, not blowing the whistle on what she knows about our president.
Yeah, no, it's completely bizarre. I think she was convicted in around 2020. So she served some time in an actual prison, I think in Florida, if I'm not mistaken. And then here we are, 2025, 2024, Trump runs around the country and gets himself elected in part on the promise that he's going to release the Epstein files and he is going to disclose to the whole world all the bad guys who got on the Epstein plane and went to Jeffrey's Island in the Caribbean, and he's going to do it, right? He and Pam Bondi are going to release the files. And then Pam Bondi comes out and she says, I've got it on my desk. I've got the files right here on my desk. Right here. Here's the files, says Pam Bondi. And then whoops, files don't get released. All of a sudden, they say it's not necessary to release the files. Wonder why that is.
Yeah, and here they've diverted all these resources away from actual law enforcement, whether it's
Right.
to comb through these records and probably redact stuff that they don't want people to see, or whether it's having federal agents out on the streets of Washington, D.C. right now. These are people that could actually be working on real human trafficking cases.
Yeah.
And instead,
And
here
normally
they're
would
being
be.
yeah, they're being utilized for all kinds of crazy things where they are not needed and frankly don't have the experience to be doing that kind of work oftentimes. So it's a disturbing situation all the way around. But if there's one thing that we know about the situation is that Donald Trump and Pam Bondi, they don't care at all about the victims.
No,
They have no
exactly.
interest in
None.
hearing from them and saying, what would you like to see happen? And how is this all impacting you? Because we know this is like a Band-Aid getting pulled off, time and time again, off of a significant wound. And they're not consulted. And that was the case with the original, conviction. Nobody
Right.
cared what they thought. And still to this day, it seems like their voices are not being heard.
No, I totally agree with you, and I think that is one of the most disgusting parts of all of this is how the victims continue to be treated in this case. And at the local level, prosecutors like you and I take victims very, very seriously. Here in Arizona, we have a constitutional Bill of Rights for victims. It's actually in our Constitution. And to see them treating the Epstein and Maxwell victims, I think it's important to use both of their names, the Epstein Maxwell victims this way, is really unbelievable in a lot of ways. Um, and they're not being consulted. Were they consulted when they transferred Ghislaine Maxwell to a minimum security, basically like summer camp type prison? It's not even a prison, it's a camp. It's a camp, right, in Texas? No. Were they consulted about that? No. Have they been consulted about the fact that these files haven't been released? No, they haven't. And so it's just like that part of it to me as a prosecutor, I find utterly unbelievable and outrageous.
Yeah, and I just want to contrast that to a fairly notable case that my office handled, which was the prosecution of Larry Nasser.
All
And
right.
what we routinely did throughout the entirety of the case, which lasted a lot longer than just the prosecution of Larry Nasser, because there were many other defendants that were prosecuted, and then there was a lot involving the release of documents from Michigan State University that they refused to release until just recently. But we would
Wow.
call them in, we would have meetings with them, we would have discussions. We would always make sure that they knew what was happening before the general public knew. We never wanted them to find out about what was happening in something involving one of their cases by reading it in the news. And we wanted to have these discussions
Right.
so that not just they knew why we were doing what they were doing, but that we were on the same page. And it was so important to have a victim-centered, trauma-informed approach where you're putting victims first, not last. And all
Right.
I can say is apparently Pam Bondi has never, ever heard of the victim-centered, trauma-informed approach, even though that is what most prosecutors, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or a nonpartisan, that's the approach that all prosecutors should, have as their North Star.
Yeah. Well, exactly. And you would think that she would understand that, having been the Attorney General of Florida. But apparently she has forgotten whatever lessons she learned in Florida
That's
on victims' rights.
because her client isn't the United States of America.
Right.
She
It's
serves but
Donald
one
Trump.
master, and that is Donald Trump. So it's
Yeah.
not about the victims, and it never will be. It will only be whatever Trump wants at that particular moment in time, the end. And that is the worst way for any prosecutor to operate.
Yeah, and I think some of the other stuff going on around the Epstein case just has to hurt so much for these victims. You know, the fact that um back when Maxwell was convicted and went to prison, Donald Trump said, "I wish her well." I mean, can you imagine any other case? Imagine any of the sex trafficking cases your office has done or my office has done. We do sex trafficking cases. We do a lot of work with our federal partners actually on those cases. Can you imagine either of us or any prosecutor saying, "I wish them well" after
Yeah,
they've been convicted?
but can you imagine any set of circumstances for your office or mine where, somebody would come in with a big checkbook and
Right.
say, I'll write you a big check, drop the investigation into me, or issue a commutation or a pardon? I mean, it would be so scandalous for that to happen to any prosecutor, whether it's a state prosecutor, a county prosecutor, a U.S. attorney. You would never have heard of anything like that. And yet it happens routinely with the Trump administration. It's just the regular course of business, and it really undermines the whole notion of what, the rule of law means and, how we conceive of what we have formerly known as what is true justice for crime victims.
Yeah. You know, I think it's going to be really interesting to see. Obviously, the Congress, ran out of town as soon as they could for the entire month of August to escape the Epstein scandal. And I guess they're coming back in September, right? And there's going to be a discharge petition to try to force the release of the Epstein files, which is bipartisan. I think that's going to be a really interesting to see that play out. And what the other thing that I'm kind of watching is, I'm a little bit of a I don't want to say fangirl of some of the Manosphere podcasts, but I watch Theo Vaughn and Joe Rogan sometimes, and they've I think there's the light bulb has gone on for those guys in the manosphere, and they're like, "Wait a second. Trump promised to release the Epstein files, and he's not doing it. And what is up with that?" And they're starting to question it on their very popular podcasts.
It's interesting. I've not yet heard this subject come up on my favorite show, 90 Day Fiance. But I will let you know that Gino and Jasmine did film right down the street from me, unbeknownst to me.
Really?
Um,
Wow.
yes, I saw it on TV. I couldn't believe it. One of our local pubs in the area here, they were just down the street. And so as of yet, I've not heard them discussing that, but I know it's just any minute now, probably
I
on the
think
very next episode.
it might, yeah, might make it on. Once again, proving that you and I have very different tastes in podcasts and, and television shows. But it's going to be interesting for sure. And, you know, I do, I don't know. I don't think there's any silver lining to this Epstein situation because the victims have never been made whole by this. The victims have never been taken seriously. Um, who knows when America will ever know the truth? Although stuff is starting to leak out. You know, it's interesting to me. I don't know if you had some thoughts on the fact that the Wall Street Journal got a hold of that insane birthday card that Donald Trump wrote
Right.
to Jeffrey Epstein with the lewd signing of his name in a certain place on a woman's body that he had drawn. But you know, I will tell you as a former reporter that I do expect more to leak out. I think it's just impossible for that to not happen. We know that Trump's name is in those files on multiple occasions. We don't know why. I mean, there's no evidence to date that Trump himself um, did anything illegal with Jeffrey Epstein, although there's a heck of a lot of circumstantial stuff around that. I mean, I just can't get out of my brain. I don't know about you. I can't get out of my brain the video footage of the two of them at some party back in the maybe 1990s. Um, partying it up, yucking it up together with Trump and Epstein pointing at young women dancing on a dance floor.
Yeah. And I always imagine when I think of you putting on your reporter hat from your time as a journalist, that it looks just like the hat that Peter Brady wore in the episodes where he was a journalist. And I don't know if you had a hat like that that you
No,
wore. No.
no, but
Okay.
I still do carry around. You know what I do? A little admission here. I still carry around with me a notebook like my reporter notebook. It's a reporter note. It's a thin notebook. I still
I'm
carry one
familiar with
around.
it because Peter Brady also had that notebook. You should know that from having, I assume, watched multiple episodes of The Brady Bunch.
I did, but I forgot about that one. Yeah. So no, I don't wear the hat. I never wore the hat, but I still think that way. I still think
Well,
like a
maybe if you had
reporter.
that hat on, you wouldn't have got thrown off of John McCain's
Straight
Maverick Express or, you
straight
know,
talk express
oh,
for the
Straight
record.
Talk Express. That's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
Maybe that
But
was the problem. They're like,
we
"Are you
need some
even a
more
journalist?
straight
Where's your
talk.
hat?"
We we need some straight talk out of Washington D.C. right now. And there's not
Absolutely.
very much straight talk going on.
That's
There's
true. Well,
a whole lot of dodging and weaving.
all of that. But you know where we will get some straight talk is, from one of the foremost experts in the country on human trafficking. And I'm really proud of the fact that my department has a human trafficking commission that is housed within the Michigan Department of Attorney General. And my chair of that commission is going to be on with us in just a moment. Her name is Melissa Palapoo. And she worked at several county prosecutors' offices. She is an expert when it comes to criminal sexual conduct cases against adults, against children. And she's been handling some really interesting cases for us. She did get an award of the Prosecutor of the Year from the Department of Homeland Security, which I think is the first year that a state prosecutor and not a federal prosecutor was given that award. And
Wow.
I'll give this away before it's publicly announced, but she actually won a global award as well for her work on human trafficking that she's going to be presented with pretty soon. So I'm really excited to have her on. This is Melissa Palaboo. Hey, Melissa, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Hi,
Good,
Melissa.
good.
Hello.
AG Kris Mays of the great state of Arizona.
It's nice to meet you.
It's great to meet you too. Thank you so much for being on with us. And AG Nessel was just singing your praises and talking about the amazing work. And we're gonna dive into the amazing work that you have been doing in Michigan. We also have a human trafficking and sex trafficking effort here at the AG's office in Arizona. It's just such an incredibly important topic and timely topic today.
Tell us, Melissa, a little bit. I think that there are a lot of misperceptions about human trafficking and what human trafficking really is. Obviously, as AG Mays and I were just discussing before you came on, of course, everyone is talking about the Jeffrey Epstein case and the Epstein files and whatever connection there is to Donald Trump himself. But that's not always what human trafficking looks like. And in fact, it might not even be what trafficking looks like most of the time. Can you sort of disabuse, I guess, us of whatever, false notions we might have about what it is and what it isn't?
Yes, absolutely. So there are so many myths that are out there regarding human trafficking. I feel like when you say human trafficking to the public, they mostly will think of two concepts. So they mostly will think of a white van driving through a neighborhood and abducting somebody. But the actual truth of it is that only 6% of traffickers even report that they were abducted in any form. So that's really just not the most common type at all. The other thing that people think about often when they're thinking of human trafficking is they think of the shipping containers filled with people or people being smuggled in. But that's not actually human trafficking. That's an entirely different crime called human smuggling. But people will get those confused. And when they're thinking of the smuggling, they're kind of forgetting that oftentimes smuggling will go hand in hand also with human trafficking. So what will happen is the people will get smuggled in, and then they'll usually be trafficked under some kind of form of debt bondage or some other false promise. But if you're just thinking about them, how they came into the country, then you're missing the whole aspect of what human trafficking is. The other thing that people often will think about when you say human trafficking, the first thing people will think about is commercial sex. And they will miss the largest part of human trafficking is actually not even commercial sex, it's labor trafficking. But people are so ill-equipped to even recognize that labor trafficking is a thing or how to identify it. But labor trafficking, as I've stated, is by far the most prevalent form of human trafficking. And that can be found, so what labor trafficking is, just to give a general sense to it, is it's just when somebody's been forced to provide labor or services. And we kind of, in Michigan at least, we separate out commercial sex, which is also forced services and labor, but we just have it as something separate. We're talking about like actual work. And so oftentimes they're forced into these situations by force, fraud, and coercion, and those are the things that Michigan requires. But they're in these situations where they might be getting some pay, but it's little to no pay. The work conditions they're terrible, they're overworked, they don't get breaks, they have these very long hours. Sometimes they're required to live on site or be very close. They get housed by the company, and so they're in these trailers, multiple people crammed in together in trailers. They don't have adequate housing at all. So that's really the most prevalent form of human trafficking worldwide, and that's including in the United States. Labor trafficking can be found in places really anywhere, but most prevalently they're found in like illicit massage parlors. You find them in nail salons, restaurants, the construction industry, farming, factory work. All of those are really, they draw in people who are going to be trafficked. And there's not a lot of oversight in those as well. And so it's easy to house when you have a farm community. You can put the trailers in the back of the property. Nobody really notices them. And it also really preys upon the most vulnerable of individuals, which oftentimes are immigrants. And so they come in and they're unaccounted and people aren't paying attention to them. So when we're thinking about human trafficking, those are the biggest myths that I've really encountered. One is that just that lack of recognition of labor trafficking, just thinking about commercial sex trafficking, and then that white van scenario. I always tell people just, always, of course, be teaching your children about stranger danger, but that is really not where you should be focusing all of your attention. You need to be focusing on how traffickers are going to get into the communities and what they're doing to get people's attention.
Is that the key to attacking this, Melissa? Is trying? I guess my question for you is, what do you, in your experience, what have you found to be the key to stopping this? And then what you said about immigrants often being the victims of this, that is so true here in Arizona. We're right on the border, and what we're finding is people will be, sometimes smuggled in, and then they are housed and in like you said, very not great housing accommodations, basically forced to work largely construction jobs here in Arizona because we're growing so fast and we have huge construction sites going on here. And then they make very little money, and they feel like they're forced to pay off the folks who smuggled them over the border or who brought them here, or we call them coyotes sometimes. But and then they feel that basically they're indentured servants to this operation.
So I think one of the best ways to really combat human trafficking is in education. And I think you have to start that education early, and it has to be often. So I don't think the public is equipped to identify human trafficking if they're not educated on human trafficking. And honestly, a lot of times traffickers will take advantage of those vulnerabilities and that lack of education. So especially when it comes to our youth get targeted by individuals that they believe they know. And I say know in quotations because they don't really know these individuals, but they are getting at our children through online means. And the means change so rapidly, and they always go beyond me. I always feel like the older I get, the less I know about what kids are actually on in the technology. But they are using social media apps, and not ones that we like use. Like, they're not talking about Facebook, and Snap is kind of moving along out of the way as well. They have new things that are always evolving. They're
Mhm.
talking to kids in video games. In fact, there's this
Right.
horse game that my child plays on, and it's just, you wouldn't even think anybody can talk, but there's a chat group that goes on
Right.
there. And that's really like targeters or traffickers target individuals in those through those means. And I just think it's really important that we educate everybody, parents, students, teachers, people in the hospitality industry. Like, we should be having mass education on human trafficking. Human trafficking should be a part of health class for schools, and that should really start in elementary school. But, if we can only get middle school and up, then we can only get middle school and up. But I think that's really, really important. I think it's important to educate the parents of children as well. I think PSAs need to go out more from states and just put out there for the communities at large to be able to identify human trafficking. I do not think that you can beat the traffickers if you are uneducated. In general, education is the building blocks to life, right? You can't beat anything without being educated. And I just think that education in this sense is very, very critical so that we can actually stop traffickers before they even start. You can prevent trafficking when you've educated people on what it is and what it isn't, and how to identify it, where to look, what are the things that you should be concerned about if you see. Like, for example, in the identification piece, when you're driving by a farm and you see a bunch of trailers in the back of it, maybe nothing is going on. That's great. But maybe something is going on. There's maybe something, maybe you put a call to the hotline and say, I see people who just never seem to leave the property and are staying there. It's those little things that we can really do to educate society in general about human trafficking. And I really think it's the only way that you can eliminate it.
Melissa, I have a question and a concern, and that has to do with, of course, the way that the Department of Homeland Security has been operating. And I know that in the past, we've looked to them and also to the FBI to be partners with us. Most human trafficking, it's not contained just within one state. The traffickers and those who are being trafficked move from state to state, and that's why we need the federal authorities to assist us. But I think it seems like people are really afraid of DHS now. And in the past, when DHS would be cooperative and treat victims like victims, And again, to get their cooperation, to give them the special visas that they're entitled to as victims of human trafficking, that instead they're just moving to deport everyone and anyone that they can possibly find. So how do you see this impacting your work? And has it made it more difficult because of this emphasis on deporting people who truly are crime victims?
So I will say that we used to have a great working relationship. And to some respects, I still believe the people we have been working with still very much care about human trafficking and fighting human trafficking. But it is really difficult to tell our victims to come forward and that we will help you when they're from the immigrant population, because we can offer no guarantees. I used to feel confident in being able to tell them, like, don't worry, we will work with you. There's all these visas out there that we can help you get. There's services that we can get you into. And now with funding cuts, those services are really falling aside. Legal services are falling aside, and those visas are becoming very difficult to even obtain. But the first problem is even getting them to step out, right? Because they're so afraid that if they just come forward at all and say anything bad about their employer or about their situation, that they're immediately going to be deported or that their family is going to be targeted for deportation. And that's a
Well, I
really
mean, the
scary
fact is
thing.
they might be immediately deported. I mean, that's the problem, right? Is the Trump administration right now is deporting anyone and everyone, no matter what. If they are, if they are not here lawfully, or even if they are here lawfully in some cases. And so, why wouldn't a person be, afraid to come forward?
Yeah, I agree. I can't offer them any more support, and the same things that I used to be able to tell them, I'm never comfortable telling them anymore because I can offer no guarantees. I can offer no The problem too is that those visas that are so critical for them, they can only get them from the federal government. And so you can't do anything about it without alerting the federal government that they need the visa. And then in alerting them that they need the visa, you are alerting them that they are not here lawfully, or that they don't have, like, their cards have expired, or their purpose for being here has expired. And that's a really scary situation for everybody that's involved. So then we're no longer protecting and helping our victims, we're actually putting them more into harm's way or more uncertainty. And so that has hindered our ability to be able to have people come forward so that we can prosecute traffickers. And it allows traffickers to run rampant because they know that there
Right.
is nobody who's going to come forward and that there's nobody who can prosecute.
So not only, of course, are they not doing anything to stem the tide of human trafficking, they're enabling it and allowing
Yep.
it to proliferate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I think, if you're not helping the victims and you're making it so they're too fearful to come forward, and traffickers see that and they know that and they know who they can take advantage. So you've made a vulnerable population even more vulnerable.
So, I mean, you've identified some of the signs of it. I'm really intrigued by your point about how these bad actors are recruiting kids even and through video games, and I think that's absolutely true. Um, what as a and Dana and I are both parents. What as parents, what should parents be looking for or talking to their kids about? So, I mean, that it strikes me that that is definitely something that we can do. Is that education piece to stem this before it even starts?
I think people need to not be scared to talk about it. I think a lot of times you have education in general too scared to talk about topics that they believe are controversial, or they believe are too, you've got to talk about sex if you're talking about human trafficking. And that's something people are too scared to talk about with their children. But really all you are doing is making your child more vulnerable, more easy to target. So I think it's very important that parents just have open conversations with their children. Explain to your children that they cannot be on this chat group. I have an 11-year-old. She wants to be on social media. She wants to chat in that horse game I talked about. And we just had this conversation yesterday where I turned off all the ability for her to have friends or to chat with anybody because it's unsafe. And then I had to tell her why it's unsafe. And it's a difficult conversation to have with a child, that you have to explain to them why they're vulnerable and what could happen if they tell somebody their address, if they tell somebody their real name, if they talk about those things. But you cannot be scared to talk about them with your children, because otherwise your children are just, they're sitting ducks for people who will talk about things with them and will mislead them into things. So I think the first thing that parents really need to do is be open with your children and monitor your children. Your children's phone is, it's got the world at their fingertips, and it's also, traffickers are in that phone and you don't even know it. Like, there's no harm in going through your child's phone. There's no harm in telling your child why you're going through their phone. I think it's just being very observant and being very willing to have open conversations with your children, and letting the school educate your children as well as to the dangers of trafficking and what it really means.
Melissa, first of all, as you know, I was a child sex prosecutor in my younger years, and we worked at the same office, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. But I don't know. I feel like I went overboard, possibly traumatizing my children and going through every scenario that I had on any of my cases, and like testing my kids on it, so much so that they would, instead of running to the ice cream man, they'd run away from him. You know what I mean? So, but that being the case, I wonder about the states that have laws where, children are just not going to be allowed on social media, or if they are, it's some pretty strict circumstances. And while, and a lot of these are red states where I don't agree with all their policies, but I'm like cheering them on. Like, yes, absolutely. I would love to see significant restrictions for minors when it comes to social media, because I believe it to be so dangerous and leaves our children vulnerable to be preyed upon. And I guess I'm wondering, both of you guys have children that are younger than I do, because my kids are now fully grown adults. But what are your thoughts about some of that? And would that help in terms of kids being taken advantage of, kids being trafficked, kids being exposed to things that they shouldn't? What are your thoughts generally?
So I think those laws are actually good. I don't see any purpose for a child to be on social media. However, I also think that children are going to be craftier than the laws, and they're probably going to be on it anyway. So I think education, even with those laws on the books, you cannot get rid of the education piece. Children need to know why they can't be on social media, along with having these rules to help protect them. I just see that they're going to create a fake username. They're going to put in a fake age. There's no way to really eliminate all of that without the education aspect of it.
I wonder though if, yeah, I think I tend to agree with you, Melissa, that, especially knowing, I mean, my daughter's 12 going on 22, and and she desperately wants to be on TikTok, and she, definitely wants to be on social media. She has a phone. I think she's, the kids are crafty. Everybody's, especially when everybody around them is on social media, it is so hard to keep them off of it. But I also know that in Europe, I think subject to check, they've got, much more controls over social media, age gating, like real age gating. So wouldn't it be possible if social media companies really wanted to be responsible, or if we could get Congress to actually do something, we could impose age gating?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think you can put age limits on things. I think you can limit children's access to certain things. Um, I absolutely think you can do those things, and I think you should do those things.
We've not talked about this, but Melissa, I would love to get your perception of everything that's happening right now with the DOJ and the White House, and of course, the Epstein files. Because, I mean, I think a lot of us are, we're really invested in it because it's just such an insane story on every level, and it's so scandalous. But like from the standpoint of like real victims of human trafficking. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it's a desensitization or desensitize, it's desensitizing the communities as to victims of human trafficking is really what it is. And it's a shame because what you're having is people explain away the victims in the Epstein case. You're having people make say, well, this is okay in this circumstance, or because Trump is involved, like I'm not going to believe that that really happened, or I'm not, so you have where people just are taking those victims who they've already come forward, they've already, adjudicated in many, and the almost the entire circumstance, I believe everything's been adjudicated in that case. And so now what you're showing other victims is if you come forward, it's never going to end for you. People are going to continue on a grand scale to think that you're not credible, to think that you're lying. It's making it so traffickers and abusers are seeing this and are seeing the rationalization of allowing for such an enterprise to continue. And that's what that is. That is a criminal enterprise. And so people are taking notes, right? They're seeing this and they're seeing this as a how-to, as opposed to what you should not do because it is a horrible thing. Instead, it becomes, like, well, go ahead, like you can do this huge criminal enterprise. People aren't going to care. And you have juries who are watching this, right? Members who are going to be in juries and they're seeing this and they're thinking it's not that big of a deal because our president says it's not that big of a deal. The entire DOJ believes this is not a big deal. So why am I here listening to this person and why do I care? Why this isn't a big deal for our country, so why are we prosecuting? And I just worry about what message that really sends to our citizens, what it sends to our victims, and really what it sends to the abusers.
Yeah, I mean, that's really true. When you look at some of the language that, even that Donald Trump used around, for instance, one of the reasons he says he broke off his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein, which was that Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell stole one of his people from Mar-a-Lago, which was one of the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, stole one of his people. What is that? What kind of language is that? As if the real problem here was that one of his people was stolen, rather than the fact that then focusing on there's a victim here who was harmed terribly. And I think that was Virginia Guffrey, who is the victim who came forward and who now lost her life. She committed suicide. I mean, it's just terrible.
It shows ownership as opposed to anything else, saying that they stole a piece of property from you.
Right.
And that's what I really worry about the community at large hearing and thinking in those terms moving forward.
Yeah. Melissa, could you tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges that you've had in bringing these cases? I know that, you've said before, and I've heard it said on many occasions, that human trafficking cases are some of the most difficult types of cases, first of all, to charge at all, and secondly, to gain convictions on, even when you have pretty strong evidence.
So human trafficking cases are just very difficult to present to a court and to a jury. You have so many obstacles before you even get there First, you have to get the survivor, the victim who is now going through a big transition and needs a lot of services and a lot of assistance. You have to get them to agree to cooperate, and you have to get them to all these hearings that continuously get delayed. And this system that just constantly will call them bad names. Criminalizing being a victim is really what has been happening, at least what I've been seeing in Michigan. And just as a side note, Michigan has been graded as an F from both recognized sources that do evaluations of states. And that's from the Polaris Project, which runs the National Human Trafficking Hotline for how we treat victims, and also from Shared Hope, which rates the states for how they handle human trafficking in general. So we are not doing a great job when it comes to our victims, and they're really the key and the crux to the cases, right? So then if you do get a victim who's willing to come forward and willing to go through all of these hurdles and all of these obstacles, they get to the court does not understand, unless it's a commercial sex case, the court does not understand in any way, shape, or form what is happening. We have a case, And it's still ongoing, so I won't get into all the specifics, but it's a typical labor trafficking case. And it's in a small town, and nobody understands that this is labor trafficking. They believe that it's just a wife working for a family business. What's the harm in that? Even though she is physically abused while she's there, and she's working these crazy long hours, she's not compensated, she's actually kept off the books. All of the things that are key labor trafficking, the courts themselves do not understand. And so the victim is up against a judge who doesn't understand what labor trafficking is and thinks maybe she's overreacting and this is just not, a big deal. And then you have a jury that you have to put this victim in front of, and the juries don't understand human trafficking. They've never been educated on it. So the prosecutor has to take the time to try to educate within the confines of law, right? We can't just provide an educational piece on human trafficking to the jury because we have legal rules that we have to follow in regards to what we can and cannot say to a jury. In fact, the judge is the one to provide the laws. But if the judge doesn't understand the human trafficking laws, they can't adequately provide those laws to the jury. So it's just this big mess when it comes to presenting a case in the criminal justice system. And then say you do get through all of those things, your victim stays on through all of those hurdles and being called all these names. If they were engaged in human trafficking, commercial sex, they're being called a prostitute over and over because that's actually the language of a lot of our statutes as well. So they're being referred to as a prostitute by everybody, including, just the way that the law reads. So then say you get a conviction, the laws are just not stiff penalties. And so even if you get a conviction, the trafficker is not necessarily even going to go to prison. And if they do go to prison, it's not going to be for that long of a time. And while they're in prison, they get to have access to their phones and to a phone, to an iPad, and they just continue their enterprises while they're in prison. So this victim never really gets away from any of that. So it makes it incredibly difficult to even start the process, to even have somebody come forward. Oftentimes they've already been they're already tainted with the system in general because of all of its failings that happen. And then you've got a jury that just is uneducated on it, doesn't understand it, thinks this victim is a criminal themselves most of the time, or is just, complaining about wages. And I feel like it's a really, really tough situation to be able to prosecute these cases. But I do feel like no matter the outcome, we still have to try. We still have to show up for our victims and say, I will stand beside you and we will fight this together. And the more you do it, the more the community gets educated on it because you're out, you're trying them and juries are seeing them and hopefully talking about what they're seeing. But it is very difficult to try a human trafficking case.
I think that's so interesting and an important point in terms of not giving up on these cases because there is an element of if we stop doing the cases, then we can't. There's that education piece gets hurt as well and starts to go away. And I think it's important also to remember, and Dana sort of pointed this out at the beginning, that it really is our most vulnerable residents and folks who are being harmed by this. I'm thinking of some statistics here in Arizona, around the average age of girls who are involved in the sex trade. So this would be, sex trafficking, but that's 14 years old. 14. That's the average age in Arizona. 5 years ago, there were approximately 78,000 male online sex ad customers in Phoenix alone. 78,000? So it gives you a sense of what we're up against here. And in 2020, there were 300 ads, more than 300 ads for adult services placed every day in Phoenix, every day, with an estimated 20% for girls under 18. So, these are vulnerable folks. And then, yeah, to your point, if it's tough to get juries to believe them, are they going to come forward? So, but we got to keep trying.
Yeah, and I will say another thing that's been a challenge is in Michigan, and this addresses some of the things that Melissa just talked about. We're trying to change the laws to make them more, victim friendly. And I really naively went into this thinking this is so bipartisan. We are not going to have any issues at all, making sure that, we are amending laws, changing laws, adding new laws to hold traffickers accountable, but also to make sure that we're doing everything we can to assist the victims. And boy, was I mistaken if I thought this was going to be easy. And one of the things that we found over the course of time is some of the state representatives or state senators that were the most opposed and would routinely vote no if these bills came up for a vote. Sometimes later on, there'd be a complaint that our department ended up investigating, and they themselves would frequent escort services and things of that nature, where likely some of those people are being trafficked. And so I just got to the point where I'm like, my gosh, like you guys are the ones, some of you legislators are the ones talking about how terrible human trafficking is all the time. But whether you know it or not, you are engaged with activities that involve people being trafficked. And, I truly believe that's one of the reasons why we're having such a difficult time getting these laws passed. And just during our lame duck session of last year, a number of our bills were up, and every Republican in the state house voted no on them.
That's insane. Really? Wow.
Yeah, it was really unfortunate, and I was very hopeful that at long last we get some of these bills through. But I know, and Ms. Melissa can speak more to this, but these are people who end up with a criminal record themselves, and they are not aiders and abettors. They are people that are oftentimes being forced into committing other crimes, not just prostitution, oftentimes crimes that are worse than that. And what we've seen from Melissa's cases is people who were themselves being trafficked and now they sort of move up in the organization. Oftentimes, I don't think it's because they have a choice, but now they're helping to go recruit other people to be trafficked just as they were recruited in that same way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that's kind of how things seem to have evolved in the Jeffrey Epstein trafficking scheme over, several decades, is that's exactly what happened. And so it's a terrible situation, but it has shown spotlight or shined a spotlight on this problem, which is a huge problem. And Melissa, to your point, it's a problem across several different areas, not just sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking. And then lastly, I would say, Deanna, you made this point, and Melissa, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Well, you probably already expressed some thoughts on it, but our here in Arizona, we attack sex trafficking and human trafficking through our partnerships with the federal government. Our internet crimes against children ICAC effort is actually a partnership with HSI. And it started because we found that men were going down to the border to try to have sex with children, or to lure children across the border, have sex with them, and then come back, into Phoenix or our cities. And, we need to have those partnerships, but man, things are getting trickier and trickier as those agencies are distracted by Donald Trump's effort to go after and to arrest and detain, gardeners and car washers instead of real criminals.
Yeah, we definitely rely on our federal partnerships here in our prosecutions. And the larger cases that we've been doing, they've been instrumental in making sure that those investigations are completed and we're able to provide prosecutions.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it bears noting that, I'm loath to denigrate each and every, federal law enforcement officer because these are the instructions that they're getting from the top. And I think that the agents that we've worked with, they're good police officers, I mean, they want to help And, they've been eager to help us with the investigations that, again, are across a multi-unit task force. But they are being told, no, you have to prioritize, again, that gardener or that dishwasher, or somebody who's working at a slaughterhouse who is, abiding by the law. They're certainly not out there committing heinous crimes, but those become the focal points of each and every investigation instead of really where we should be diverting our attention, which is to people who are really out there hurting so many people in the most egregious ways.
For sure. Last question I have for you, Melissa, is what, in terms of what you see going on in other states and efforts in other states or at the federal level, what kind of additional resources do you need, or does this field, this area of prosecution and investigation need to really, really make a dent in this problem?
We need more financial assistance, right? These investigations take a very long time and they're very costly. So we're prosecuting right now a large illicit massage parlor ring. And that took a ton of resources. And we did it with some help from the federal government. But there are so many more of those that are out there as well. There just isn't enough money that goes into being able to prosecute these cases. We need that. We need a lot more funding for the advocacy groups so that our victims can get the assistance they need, because my case is only as strong as my victim, right? So if they're not able to get the assistance they need so that they can be stronger by the time trial happens, then trial can't happen. So we need to make sure that those advocacy groups are getting the funding and the resources that they need so that our victims can get the support that they need to be able to withstand going through a trial.
Well, I think we need to wrap up. I do want to say, well, first of all, thank you, Melissa, for all of the amazing work that you're doing in Michigan and that our team is doing down here in Arizona. Wanted to also say that victims of human trafficking or those who have identified someone they think may need help can contact obviously our offices, but also the National Human Trafficking Resource Center at 888-373-7888 or text 233-733. So please reach out to law enforcement if you see this happening.
Well, thanks for all your great work, Melissa, and thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in to this episode of Pantsuits and Lawsuits. Dana, great episode as usual.
And remember, the first step to fight to end human trafficking all starts with you. Talk with your friends and your neighbors, and if you see something, say something. We all have to work together if we're going to actually make a difference.
For sure. So also remember to follow us on social media, everywhere you get your social media, and check our websites to stay up to date with the latest work in our various departments. Subscribe, go to YouTube. I think we're on Facebook. We're on all the channels. So follow us and subscribe, and we're looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Yeah. So until next time, stay safe, stay cool. The one good thing I will say about all the humidity that we have here in Michigan, that you now have in Arizona, is that people can't tell if we're going through menopause or not. So I will just say that one very positive thing. Is it menopause or maybe just the weather?
It could be a hot flash. It could be, it's just humid.
Exactly. So I guess that's the one good thing we can say about climate change.
We'll see you next time, Dana.
All right. Bye, everybody.